I'm Ryan O'Dowd, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today I'm continuing with Section 517, Coup D'Etat, by Edward Luttwak. We're picking up in Chapter 5, the execution of the Coup D'Etat. Timing, sequence, and security. Ideally, the timing of the coup will be completely flexible so that we can take advantage of any favorable circumstances which may arise, such as the temporary absence of the leadership from the capital city or the outbreak of some coincidental civil disorders. This flexibility, which would be highly desirable, is only rarely possible because the infiltration of the army and police will be a dynamically unstable process. The circle of those who have decided to join us will grow and continue growing as a bandwagon effect is generated. But unless the coup materializes, there will eventually be a movement into neutrality or even opposition. Meanwhile, the danger of denunciation will also increase as more and more people become aware that a coup is being planned, or at any rate that something is up. The timing of the coup will therefore be dictated by the progress of our infiltration of the armed forces and police, and as soon as a satisfactory degree of penetration is achieved, the coup must be executed. This implies that it will not be possible to designate a date well in advance of the coup, which can be communicated to the various teams. This is just as well, since it means that the date cannot be leaked to the security agencies. Actually, it is quite likely that some information about us will have reached the security agencies, but this should not affect the outcome. As the preparations for the coup proceed, more and more information about our actions will be in circulation, but it will also be increasingly obscured by, quote, noise. Every move we make will generate information which could eventually take the security agencies, but the consequences and misinterpretations of our actions will generate an equal or greater amount of, quote, noise. This will make it increasingly difficult for the analysts of the security agencies to identify the nature of the threat, since their capacity for processing information is not unlimited. This process is illustrated by Figure 7, in which O to the Z is the normal level of noise which is received at all times. O to the A is the processing capacity of the analysts of the security agencies, and X is the point beyond which the total flow of data exceeds processing capacity, so that each item of real data is accorded a diminishing amount of attention. Editor's note. There is a chart that says 7, and it does exactly what it just said. It shows you that the total amount of information that can be created will eventually overwhelm the processing capacity of the analyst. In other words, you lie so much that all the non-lives just become another piece of data. Incidentally, that's happening in other ways in our country and the world right now. Not to get into it. Moving on. Even if the security agencies could isolate the real data from the noise, they will not usually take immediate action. Their professional instincts will try to explore all the ramifications of the plot so as to be able to arrest all its participants. And hopefully, the coup will actually take place while the security agencies are still engaged on these explorations. But the latter will be aware of this timing problem and are therefore likely to respond to a possible threat by going ahead and arresting those of the planners of the coup who have been identified. This nervousness presents a special problem on the eve of the coup, because our final preparations will probably generate a sharp increase in the total flow of information received by the security agencies. Even without separating hard data from noise, the mere increase in the total flow of information could be interpreted as a danger signal, as it certainly would be by competent analysts, and this might trigger off the arrests. In practice, it will rarely be possible to achieve total security within the forces of the coup, and we should assume as a working hypothesis that they have in fact been infiltrated by the security agency. This leads to the general defensive procedures discussed in Chapter 3, but it will also have a precise operational implication. A. Each team will be told well in advance what equipment and tactics will be required to seize its particular target, but not the exact designation of the target. B. Each team will only be told its designated target when it actually receives the signal to proceed to its seizure. And C. Each team will be alerted individually, with only as much advance warning as it requires to prepare for its particular task, instead of general go signal for all teams. Since the teams will have different starting points and different targets to go to, the use of any one general signal would either give insufficient warning to some teams or an unnecessarily long one to others. The longer the time span between the announcement that the coup is on and its actual execution, the greater is the likelihood that information will reach the security agencies in time to prevent the successful execution of the coup, since this will be the moment at which their operative in our ranks could send out a warning. The problem of warning time and lead time is illustrated in Figure 8. If we give all our teams a 10-hour warning period, by sending out a general call at hour 10, then team number 1 will just about reach its target in time, but all the other teams will have received excess warning, or in other words, information will have been distributed before it was essential to do so. If we give all the teams a 2-hour warning period, then excess warning will be 0, but team number 5 will reach its target several hours before team number 1, and those defending it will probably be on full alert. The solution appears to be a simple one. Make warning time equal to lead time so that each team is alerted just in time to allow it to reach its target by the 0 hour. But in reality, the problem is more complex. It's not a matter of simultaneous arrival at the target, but rather of the simultaneous penetration of the early warning system maintained by the security agencies of the state. If, for example, team number 2 had to cross the entire capital city to reach its target, the security agency will probably be alerted as soon as it enters the city at, say, hour -2. Thus, by the time number 4 reached its target, the opposition would have had 2 hours to prepare for its defense. We will probably have very little information on the functioning of the security apparatus, but we can operate on the assumption that a team, if it is large and or equipped with armor, will be noticed and reported as soon as it enters the capital city. We must therefore secure A, the protection of our security position against an internal threat, which is achieved by minimizing excess warning time, and B, the protection of our security position against external observation, which is achieved by simultaneous penetration of the capital city area. Both aims will be achieved by sending the teams into action at a time corresponding to their lead times to the capital city boundary. This is illustrated in Figure 9. Into action. The actual execution of the coup will require many different qualities: skillful diplomacy at a blocking position confronted by loyalist forces, instant personnel management at the radio television station in order to persuade its technical staff to cooperate with us, considerable tactical abilities in the case of targets which are heavily defended. Our resources will probably be too limited to form fully specialized teams out of the pool of these units and individuals which we have incorporated, but we should nevertheless match broad categories of targets with appropriate teams. We can distinguish between 3 such categories of targets with their corresponding teams. A targets. These are the more heavily guarded facilities with strict pass control, such as the Royal or Presidential Palace, the Central Police Station, and the Army Headquarters. In times of crisis, of course, such facilities may be provided with fully fledged military defenses, and in many countries the crisis is permanent. Partly in order to minimize bloodshed, we could have a destabilizing effect on the situation, and partly in order to reduce the total manpower required, these targets will have to be seized by sophisticated teams using a blend of infiltration, diversion, and assault. Though it will usually be necessary to prepare for a fairly extensive military operation, and a complex one as well, unless we have great numerical superiority in the area of the target, this should not result in much actual combat. Even those who guard the target in question are confronted by our excessive preparations. They are unlikely to put up much serious resistance. The fact that our general measures of neutralization have cut off or impeded their contacts with the leadership, the fact that the clear patriotic issues of international warfare will be missing in an internal conflict, and the fact that we will make every effort to allow them to give in gracefully, we will all mitigate against a prolonged defense. If we are fortunate enough to have incorporated a very large number of troops, and especially if they are equipped with impressive weapons such as armor, it will still be less likely that the actual combat will take place. These targets will nevertheless indirectly present us with a very serious problem. Though it is political rather than military, the formation of the large teams required by these targets will raise the delicate issue of the coup within the coup. During the active phase of the coup, the situation will be confused and extremely unstable. And while the other teams will be too small to tempt their leaders into trying to usurp our control, the operational leaders of the A teams may well succumb to temptation. The man who leads the tanks, which have just seized the presidential palace, may easily persuade himself that he can also seize power on his own behalf, and if the A team is sufficiently powerful, he may do just that. Our satisfaction at carrying out a coup successfully would be an insufficient reward for all our efforts unless we also retain power afterwards. It will therefore be necessary to adopt measures to prevent the leaders of these large teams from challenging our position. This can sometimes be done by forming the A teams from many small subunits under the overall command of an inner member of our own group. Where this is not possible, the A teams will have to be dispersed into smaller groups assigned to secondary targets as soon as they have fulfilled their primary mission. Thus, the possible threat presented by their A teams will be deflected by applying the energies of their leaders to other tasks. The operational commanders of the A teams will probably need a certain amount of time to readjust to the fact that they are no longer isolated individuals engaged on a dangerous endeavor and to start thinking in more ambitious terms. Matters should be so arranged that they are deprived of their large and unified teams before the transition is made in their minds. B targets. These are the technical facilities which will not usually be heavily guarded, and which in any case we want to neutralize rather than seize, such as the telephone exchange, the telegraph office, and secondary radio television stations. Each of those targets will be assigned to a small team whose personnel will include a technician, whose presence should help to minimize the amount of physical damage resulting from sabotage. If it's possible to interdict these targets by minor and external sabotage, the B team may consist of just 1 or 2 technically competent operators. Even if the actual building has to be entered for a short time, the B team will still be a small one, but in this case it should be overt and consist of uniformed soldiers or policemen. C targets. These are the individuals we wish to hold in isolation for the duration of the coup. In the case of the main leader of the government, the arrest will be subsumed in the seizure of the presidential palace and other similar A targets, and therefore the other C targets should not present a penetration problem. But they will present an evasion problem. A radio station or a royal palace can be very difficult targets to seize, but at least they cannot escape or conceal their identity. The personalities whom we wish to arrest will try to do both. It will therefore be essential to devote our early attentions to these targets so as to ensure that they are seized before they can evade our teams. This will usually imply that the C teams will go into operation marginally earlier than the other teams, and they can do so without breaking the rule of simultaneous penetration of the early warning system, because they should be sufficiently small and dispersed to act covertly. Because those targets are human, they will be inherently more problematic than some of our other objectives. And individuals concerned, apart from escaping or concealing their identity, could also try to subvert the very teams to arrest them. In the case of particularly charismatic figures, our teams will have to be formed from especially selected personnel. In some cases, it may even be necessary to include an inner member of our group. These C teams will be small, since the task will be a matter of entering a private residence and overpowering 1 or 2 guards. The exact size of each team will depend on the overall balance of resources and requirements under which we operate, but will rarely exceed a dozen men or so. Once the individuals which form this group of targets have been arrested, we will have to ensure that they are kept under a secure form of control. Our purpose in arresting them is to prevent them from using their influence and their charisma against us, and this can only be achieved if we can insulate them from the public for the whole duration of the coup. Such individuals are often the only casualties of otherwise bloodless coups, because it's often easier to eliminate them rather than to keep them as captives. If we do keep them, the ad hoc prison used must be secret and internally secure. The liberation of a popular public figure could be a powerful focus of counter-coup actions. On the part of the opposition, and secrecy will be a more reliable defense than any physical barrier. While the teams are on their way to their respective targets, our other allies will also come into action. The individuals we have subverted in various parts of the armed forces and bureaucracy will carry out their limited missions of technical neutralization. And the groups assigned to the blocking positions will be moving to take up their planned locations designed to isolate the loyalist forces. In the case of these dispersed individuals, whose contribution will be extremely important though almost totally invisible, there will be a signaling problem. Since they are scattered throughout the sensitive parts of the state apparatus, it will be difficult to reach them individually. Further, they may include informants of the security agencies because, unlike the personnel of the various teams and blocking forces, they have been recruited as isolated individuals, and therefore the mutual surveillance exercised on our behalf in the teams will not operate. Thus, it would be dangerous to give them advance warning of the coup, and their signal to go into action will have to be our first broadcast on the radio-television station, except in particular cases where the facility to be neutralized requires early attention. Our operational control over the various groups cooperating with us will aim at achieving 2 objectives. A, as always, maximum speed in the execution of their tasks, and B, the use of the absolute minimum of force. This will be important not only because of the psychological and political factors previously mentioned, but also for a more direct technical reason, the external uniformity between the 2 sides of the conflict. Our teams will, of course, be the nationals of the country in which the coup is being staged, and most of them will be soldiers and policemen wearing the same uniforms as those of the opposition. This uniformity will give us a measure of protection, since the loyalist forces will not readily know who's loyal and who is not. Usually it would be a mistake to prejudice the protective cover by adopting distinctive armbands or other conventional labels, since we will need all the protection we can get. Thus, as the teams move around the capital city, probably at night, they will probably not be fired upon, unless they open fire first. To do so would be to facilitate the work of the opposition, since this would be the only way of distinguishing between their own forces and ourselves. Further, since our teams have always been kept separate, initially to prevent the penetration of the security agencies and now to protect our own position within the forces of the coup, there will be a danger of conflict between our own teams. The confusion we generate in the minds of the opposition could therefore exact a price in confusion within our own ranks. This may have serious consequences unless our forces respect the rule of a minimal and purely defensive use of force. Thus concludes section 517. Of Coup D'Etat by Edward Luttwak. Carrying on Chapter 5, The Execution of the Coup d'Etat, which will also continue tomorrow in Section 518, the immediate post-coup situation. I will see you then. Alam.